Now that we have discussed about what DOM is, let us now begin understanding how we can start integrating JavaScript with HTML. And I have my code pen open up. If you are using Visual Studio Code to kind of do it, I will show you the steps which you need to take in order to integrate your JavaScript file with the HTML. So what I'm going to do is I am going to first of all create some HTML first, and then we'll jump into the JavaScript bit to kind of see how we can integrate the HTML, or how we can call the HTML elements inside of our JavaScript file. Now, as we saw with the case of CSS, that HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, all three of them are independent of each other, and we need to make the necessary connections between them. So with HTML and CSS, the connection or the bridge between these two was the CSS selectors. So we were using multiple CSS selectors to target the different HTML elements which needed to be styled. Pretty much the same way, there are a lot of inbuilt JavaScript methods which we can use to kind of call those HTML elements into the JavaScript world, and we can start manipulating it by different properties. So what I am going to do is, let's create a basic HTML structure. So I'm going to say a div, and let's say there is a button here, right? And it says click me, right? And let's give this button a class of btn, and also give this an ID of unique, right? And now inside of my JavaScript, let's discuss the different DOM selectors available in JavaScript. So the first one with which we can call the HTML element in the JavaScript world is something called get elements by class name. So get elements by class name basically returns me a HTML collection of all those HTML elements which have a certain class name, right? So I'm going to say const buttons, and remember that class names, multiple elements could have the same class names, and that is because it will return, and that is the only reason it will return multiple. It can possibly return multiple elements. So I'm going to say const buttons is equal to document dot query dot get elements by class name, right? And then inside of this, you basically pass in the name of the class. So let's say I pass in the name of the class to be btn. Now all of these methods which you are seeing, all of these DOM selection methods that you are seeing, will be part of the document object. This is something which is inbuilt inside of JavaScript. You don't actually need to do any sort of configuration here, right? So this, all of these methods and properties that we will be seeing from now on will be part of the document object itself, and you can directly access it, right? And now if I do a console.log of btns, right, and I go to my console here inside of my DevTools, I am seeing that I'm getting a HTML collection of one element, and I'm getting that this is the button of ID unique and a class of button. I'm getting a collection or a list of all the HTML elements which have a class of button, right? If I created another button, or let's create another element with the same class name, so I'm going to say anchor tag, right? Just for the sake of it, and I'm going to give it a class of btn, right? And let's say this is link. Now if I go back to my DevTools, inside of my console, I can see that now I'm getting a collection of two elements instead of one. I'm getting both the button as well as anchor tag, right? Now, for those people who are using Visual Studio Code, right, in order to integrate your JavaScript file with your HTML, before your body tag, before your end of your body tag, what you can do is you can include a script tag like this, right? And inside of the script tag, you can define the source to be whatever JavaScript file you're doing. Let's say you named it main.js. .js is the extension for all of the JavaScript files that you create, right? And this, you can pass in the async or the defer value. I would prefer that you use the defer value so that it waits for the entire HTML to load before it actually starts loading up the script, although that attribute is completely optional. But using this property, now you have integrated the JavaScript file with your HTML, right? And now you can start typing your code here, and then you can start seeing the output in your DevTools. But because I'm using CodePen, I don't need to make that connection. That connection is already present. So this is how we include multiple elements using get elements by class name. Now there is a difference between HTML collection, right? We saw that get elements by class name actually returns me an HTML collection. And then there is something called node list. Now, HTML collection and node list are pretty much the same thing. They return me a list of something. HTML collection will return me a list of different HTML elements, whereas the node list will return me a list of or a group of multiple nodes. Now, these nodes could be a combination of HTML tags, all of the content inside of HTML tags and all of it, right? So get elements by class name is actually returning me a HTML collection, right? An HTML collection cannot work as an array. To prove my point, because I have two of my HTML elements having the same class name, if I did something like this, let's say I wanted to access the first element, right? I wanted to access the first element, right? I will just get the actual HTML element and not the properties associated to it. That is what I'm getting here, right? I am only getting the button, right? So in order for this buttons to be iterated or used as an array, right? Because although they can be accessed using indexes, right? Whenever I will go ahead and iterate over an HTML collection, I need to convert it into a node list, or I need to convert it into an iterable data structure, which is kind of like an array structure. And to do that, you can use an inbuilt property called array.from and wrap up the HTML collection inside a pair of brackets like this. Now this buttons will no longer be a non-iterable format of like a list of different HTML elements, but now you can use conventional for loops to kind of loop over these HTML elements and access them, right? So get elements by class name is one of the DOM query selectors, and because it is returning me an HTML collection, I can convert it into an array. I can force the conversion into an array using the array.from method. Similar to get elements by class name, we have another DOM selector that is called get element by ID. Now get element by ID, you can see that this is not an elements, but this is an element, because usually when you're targeting any HTML element having an ID, you are only targeting one HTML element, owing to the fact that ideally every unique ID is associated to one HTML element. Now, in order to target this, I will say document dot get element by ID, and the ID which I'm looking out for is unique. And now I will do a console.log of the actual button, right? And if I go to my dev tools, right? If I go to my DevTools, then I will see the button is actually present along with all of the different properties. You will see that all of the different inbuilt methods and properties which are required for the manipulation of this button, that is included, because the get elements by ID is also returning me is returning me a list of one element, a single element with all of its property, and this is also returning me an HTML collection. So whenever you want to target one HTML element, or you want just to get that HTML element which has an ID to it, you use get element by ID. Similarly, to get element by ID and get elements by class name, we have another DOM selector by the name of get elements by tag name, and this is exactly what it sounds. If you want to target a particular type of HTML element, let's say I had a couple of anchor tags like this, right? And I did not give them a class. I did not give them a class, right? Let's remove the classes. Let's remove the classes from here, and I wanted to target all of these anchor tags, right? And I wanted, because I did not give them a common class, I wanted them to group together using the anchor tag. I can use the get elements by tag name DOM selector, and here I can pass in the name of the HTML tag that I want to target, right? And let's now do a console.log of document.get elements by tag name, right? And I'm going to get a collection. You can see I'm getting a HTML collection. Again, this is also returning me an HTML collection of 3 elements, which are all anchor tags, and each of them have all of these properties and inbuilt methods associated to it. So whenever you want to target elements by their actual name, you can use the get elements by tag name. Now we have discussed about selecting or kind of calling HTML elements using class names, using ID, and using tag names. There is one generic DOM selector, or rather two generic DOM selector, which you can use, and that is perhaps the most commonly used DOM selector, which is called a query selector. Now, query selector differs from all of the other types of DOM selectors owing to the fact that inside a pair of this string, I can pass in a CSS selector, right? I can pass in a complex looking CSS selector. I can pass in different combinations of CSS combinators, and that particular CSS selector, which is associated to an HTML element, that will get targeted. So for example, inside of this div, let's say I want to target, let's say this has a class of div link, right? Now I want to target, and let's also give this an ID of wrapper, right? So I want to target the anchor inside of the div which has an ID of wrapper. So I'm basically creating a CSS selector here. So I can pass that CSS selector inside of my query selector, and that particular HTML element or this is only for single element. So that particular element will get targeted. So I can write something like this, wrapper, and then because that is a direct child, I will say dot div hyphen link. And now once I do console.log of buttons or button, right, I go back to my HTML. Now I'm getting that particular HTML element which satisfies this particular CSS selector. So you can construct your CSS combinators. You can use all sorts of different combinations and complex combinations of CSS selectors to select one HTML element, and query selector selects only one HTML element. If there are multiple HTML elements of the same criteria, the first element which passes this particular criteria will be selected. If you want to select all of the HTML elements completing this criteria, instead of using query selector, you can use query selector all, right? And let's also give this a class of div length. And now if I go back to my console.log, I am going to get a node list. Now this is the difference between query selector all with the rest of the other DOM selectors. All of them were basically returning an HTML collection, but here I am only getting a node list. And the difference between HTML collection and node list, as we already discussed, is not that great, right? There is not a stark difference between them, and you can use either one of them to kind of get your required output, right? And you can see here in the node list, I am getting a list of these two anchor tags having the class name of div link. So these are the different ways with which you can select multiple HTML elements inside of your JavaScript. So just to summarize whatever we have done so far and whatever are the DOM selectors, we started off with the get elements by class name, right? Get elements by class name is used to select a list of HTML elements having the same class name, and get elements by class name returns me a HTML collection. The second thing that we discussed was get elements by ID or get element by ID, right? Get element by ID will only return me one single HTML element because IDs need to be unique for each and every HTML element. Then we continued with get elements by tag name. Whenever we want to target HTML elements solely by their own tag name, I can get an HTML collection for these. And all of these three DOM selectors actually returned me an HTML collection. Now, there is a generic way of using CSS selectors and CSS combinators to target that inside of JavaScript, and that is using query selector and query selector all. And query selector and query selector all basically returns me a node list. Now, the choice of using a DOM selector is entirely up to you, your preferences and your requirements. There is no hard and stop rule of using a certain type of DOM selector over the other. There is no performance benefit of you choosing one over the another, right? It's entirely up to your discretion, and you can use these different DOM selectors in a variety of ways to kind of target nested HTML elements or HTML elements which fulfill a certain criteria. That brings us to the end of DOM selectors, right? And we will continue our discussion of like the DOM selector and now what to do with the JavaScript bit in the further videos. Till then, goodbye.